Hello all, dear presenters, dear members of the audience. On behalf of the KU Leuven Institute for Media Studies, it is my pleasure to welcome you at this third webinar on radicalism, extremism, and Islamophobia. This event is part of communication activities of the H2020 project Extremely United. Also, Professor Leen Danes and Dr. Ans de Nolf have put and are putting a lot of work in behind the scenes. Building on last year's insights, we would like to now focus on the issues that are currently pressing. More specifically, the far-right voices that are still becoming increasingly louder, and as Dr. Iko Mali from the University of Tilburg has shown, these voices have entered the mainstream. On the platform provided by Extremely United, I hope you will find with us a necessary space for new constructive insights, relevant for academia, policy, and practice. This is ingrained in the Extremely United community of practice. Three aspects stand out. Firstly, the consortium's appreciation for the notion of luring people into extremism. Secondly, the value of social cohesion in defense against that luring and extremism. And thirdly, the notion that the locus of control lies simultaneously in different spaces. These aspects are not self-evident. There is this widespread idea that there are ideologies that turn people towards extremism, which implicates that adherents of a certain ideology should observe moderation towards their convictions, and even that surveillance on this moderation becomes legitimate. Already in 2013, Dr. Alex Schmidt advocated in a research paper for the International Center for Counterterrorism that ideologies play an important role, but rather as an a posteriori rationalization. With the next slide, I would like to put things into perspective. I will take you back to Dr. Thomas Frisse's doctoral dissertation, defended at KU Leuven University in May 2019, and to his flywheel model, presented here last year, that shows ideology as somewhat of a smokescreen from the part of the recruiter, rather than a direct instigator of violence. Moreover, the recruiters that make us believe their actions are purely ideology-driven, as to incite repressive measures from our politicians, with a disproportional safety logic to create grievances. Control these ideologists, in this case, control Muslims, their cultures, their customs, their clothing, their Islamization. In sum, a contemporary form of Foucauldian biopolitics, as elaborated by Dr. Nadia Fadil in her 2019 volume on radicalization. However, for some reason, these new constructive insights from communication sciences and anthropology have not yet mainstreamed or became part of a scientific consensus. So let us, on the next slide, appreciate this platform by expanding on these new constructive insights and focus on grievances. Grievances that may turn antisocial ideologies into rational choices for those in such need. This is only happening in exceptional cases, for as Dr. Schmidt also argues, the number of extremists doesn't allow for these big generalizations. And indeed, usually our welfare societies provide decent safety nets for those with grievances. So it doesn't have to come to extremism. I'm assuming this is very recognizable for all of us. The social institutions in our societies, such as family, school, work, associations, social work, police, justice, and media, provide adequate support when dealing with grievances, which could be based on mourning when we lose a loved one, on failure when we attempt projects or a career, an exclusion into different spheres in society. But sometimes, in a very small number of cases, people are not or insufficiently supported by institutions and become disengaged from our society and susceptible for recruitment or re-engagement into illegal social institutions, which serve a whole other political agenda. But they are, of course, adequately embellished with alternative ideologies. This causes social alienation from societies and exposes the rarely occurring complete process of going from well-being to extremism. The next slide deals with Islamophobia, which accounts for the creation of big and long-standing grievances. And today we will be discussing in various presentations the production and the effect of Islamophobia on Muslims. Before we get to the first speaker, I would like to tell you that you can put your questions in the Q&A section during the presentations, and we will deal with them, or we will address them at the end of the presentations. Our first speaker is Professor Désiree Schmuck. We were very excited to welcome her to our university, I think about 2 years ago, as a professor on digital media effects, measured on social cohesion, inclusive well-being, democratic engagement, and intergroup relations. Her expertise today pertains to the exclusionary right-wing discourses, which she applied in a study where this discourse is spread through the free space of the internet, resulting in an empirically measured long-term effect on discrimination grievances. If you are ready, Professor, you can take the floor.
Yes, hello, thank you for this introduction. Welcome to my presentation, Muslims Take Action. In this project, I studied together with a former master student from the University of Amsterdam how exposure to Islamophobic political messages affects young Muslims' support for collective action. I would like to start my presentation with an example. In 2018, the Dutch Freedom Party released a video displaying a series of phrases associating Islam with terrorism and hatred until ultimately reaching the phrase, "Islam is deadly." The letters were displayed in blood red color, accompanied by music that was fit for a horror film. And this video not only aired on a Dutch public broadcasting channel during airtime reserved for political parties, but also appeared on the party's social media pages. And although this example arguably represents an extreme example of right-wing populist campaigns targeted against Muslims and Islam, portrayals of Muslims and Islam as a violent religion and Muslims as a threat to Western societies are not rare in the political communication of right-wing populist political parties, especially not in Europe. However, negative portrayals of Muslims and Islam in political communication are not limited to Europe, with, for example, Donald Trump having been a very prominent example in the US. Islamophobic right-wing populist political messages clearly mark the border between good people, namely non-Muslim majority members, and Muslims as dangerous others. And such rhetorical othering reflects the core of populism, which can be seen in the moral and causal construction of a divide between a blameless in-group and an objectionable out-group. And to disseminate such messages, social media are not only readily available for populist politicians because they circumvent journalistic filters, but social media channels also allow political actors to broadcast emotionally charged, threatening content directly to the people. And many populist politicians use social media platforms as their primary tool of communication, as, for example, Donald Trump's communication via Twitter demonstrated. In real-world environments, individuals confront such negative political content not only once, but usually repeatedly. When political parties launch a new poster, a video, or an ad, audiences typically encounter that content several times. And this is especially true for social media, where, for example, paid social media advertising or native advertising can hardly be circumvented. And research on media effects has suggested that this recurring coverage is not only common, but can also influence public opinion more strongly than being exposed to such messages only once. And especially in the context of political campaigns, research suggests that repeating information can strengthen the effects of a message, especially when the content is negative, which is definitely the case for Islamophobic messages. What does this mean for those people who are portrayed in these Islamophobic messages? That is, Muslim minority members in Western societies. Drawing from social identity theory, negative portrayals of Muslims in the media and in political campaigns can threaten Muslim social identity. Scholars have shown that in response to anti-Islamic political campaigns, Muslims have employed individual-level coping strategies that can restore a positive social identity, such as, for example, reducing their identification with the majority population or the nation, and increasing hostile attitudes toward members of the non-Muslim outgroup. However, other research also suggests that minorities may not only employ such individual coping strategies, but also more collective coping strategies that can improve their image as a whole in society. And based on the so-called social identity model of collective action, short SIMCA, individuals may engage in coping strategies that improve their group status, including collective actions. For example, participating in demonstrations, protesting. However, perceived discrimination that stems from such messages may not only foster so-called normative collective action, but may also result in non-normative collective action, including extremist, radical, violent actions. However, such non-normative collective action has mostly been neglected in this research area so far associated with right-wing populist political campaigns. So in this study, we hypothesized that, first of all, one-time exposure to Islamophobic populist social media communication will increase young Muslims' perceived discrimination. However, based on previous research suggesting that repeated exposure strengthens message effects, we expected that repeated exposure to anti-Islamic populist communication would even result in more perceived discrimination among people exposed to these messages. And furthermore, in line with the social identity model of collective action, we expected that perceived discrimination would result in actions that are reserved to restore a positive social identity and mobilize people to seek change, therefore increasing collective action intentions. We also expected that perceived discrimination might result in higher non-normative collective action intentions. And lastly, since the existing research completely lacked an investigation of how long the duration of such effects is, in this study we wanted to know whether one-time exposure to right-wing populist political messages, whether these effects are still detectable after a few weeks. So to test these hypotheses and to investigate that research question, we conducted a between subjects experimental study with a longitudinal design in Austria. We recruited 143 self-identified young Muslims between 18 and 37 years based in Austria. And the experiment was performed online, and before the experiment, participants were screened via a pre-questionnaire. All participants actively consented to the study, received a disclaimer before being exposed to that content, and were extensively debriefed after the study. In this experiment, we used material from the Austrian right-wing populist party FPÖ, which is known for their anti-Islamic communication. And we designed two groups, a control group where people were exposed to videos by the right-wing populist Austrian party without any references to Islam or Muslims, whereas participants in the two treatment groups were exposed to videos by this party that were Islamophobic and portraying Muslims in a negative, stereotypical and threatening way. We had two treatment groups. We had a one-time exposure group and a repeated exposure group. So as you can see here, the control group and the one-time group was only exposed to content once, whereas the repeated exposure group also saw additional Islamophobic video clips by the FPÖ a day, a week, and 2 weeks after their initial exposure to the video. And lastly, all participants in all groups completed questionnaires with the same items asking about perceived discrimination and collective action intentions immediately 2 weeks and 3 weeks after initial exposure. So what did our results show? In a first step, we employed ANOVA, mixed design measurement ANOVA, to test the effects of single and repeated exposure to right-wing populist political content on perceived discrimination at each time point, immediately 2 weeks and 3 weeks after exposure. And we found a strong, significant main effect showing that one-time and repeated exposure groups had way higher perceived discrimination levels than the control group at all time points. So they indicated to feel discriminated by the content. We also saw that this effect was the strongest immediately after exposure and decreased over time. And this was the case in all experimental groups, irrespective of exposure was repeated or only once. And furthermore, we also found support for the assumption that perceived discrimination would result in higher intentions for normative collective action. And we saw this effect at 2 time points. We also controlled for previous levels of normative collective action. And so this third hypothesis was also confirmed. However, we did not see any relations between perceived discrimination and non-normative collective action, including extremist or violent actions. So overall, the findings show that there can be lasting effects of exposure to anti-Islamic populist social media communication, even after one-time exposure. Repeated exposure did not have any incremental effect in this study, which may be explained by the already very high perceived discrimination levels after one-time exposure compared to the control group. So there was maybe not enough additional increase possible after multiple exposure. Overall, our findings are also in line with the social identity model of collective action, suggesting that when young Muslims faced perceived inequality, they wanted to respond by engaging in actions that could improve their in-group's image and help them restore a positive social identity. However, perceived discrimination only increased normative, not non-normative collective action intentions. And here the literature suggests that non-normative collective action typically occurs in situations when perceptions of injustice are extremely high and normative collective action is already deemed as ineffective. So our findings suggest that young Muslims still seem to consider normative collective action to be a useful tool to challenge such discrimination based on right-wing populist political social media communication. Of course, the study also has some notable limitations. For example, we only used self-reports. We only asked about intentions to perform collective action, not actual behavior. And also we only focused on one minority group, Muslims, although other minority groups are also targeted by right-wing populist parties. But overall, our findings have both an optimistic and a pessimistic outlook. On the positive side, we saw that discrimination is challenged with normative collective action, acting against discrimination by signing a petition, engaging in demonstrations, for example, which is a more useful tool than withdrawing from civic engagement completely, or avoiding the mainstream media or the majority population. However, on a negative outlook, we also saw that these videos increase discrimination, and this effect can also last over several weeks. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Schmuck, for showing us how indeed an ideology can incite grievances. It's very interesting study. If you have questions for the professor, you can put them in the Q&A and we will get back to them at the end of the presentations. Now we move on to the next speaker, which is Dr. Luis Manuel Hernandez Aguiar, and he works at the University of Amsterdam, which has a long tradition of strong contributors to this field. His expertise lies in the European Muslim biopolitics, if I may frame it as such, because it's a really broad expertise that he has. And he will apply to some kind of a white innocence going on in Germany, a we didn't know position versus empirically measured discrimination. So if you're ready, Luis, you can give us more details on that.
Very happy to be here. Well, as the title of my presentation today is Islamophobia in Germany, still a debate. And so in a sense, I will be talking about what it seems to me a paradox. On the one hand, the empirical realities of Islamophobia as a form of racism. And on the other hand, state-led discussions minimizing the extent of this reality. Once I have settled that score, I will move towards briefly discussing racial conspiracy theories as that pristine example showing the functioning of racism in German social political life. Sorry. A little bit of context about why it's so difficult to acknowledge the existence of racism in Germany. As in many other countries, European countries, the myth of a post-racial nation has taken a strong hold in Germany, but in Germany is particularly important as it is related to the reconstruction of the German nation and identity in the post-Second World War era. And this myth, of course, does not entail that racial formations are inexistent, but rather functions as a masquerade, obliterating discussions on the topic. And so, for instance, both the mythical process of denazification as well as the 0 hour, the moment of rebirth of the nation, have functioned as historical dispositives through which the German nation could imagine itself as overcoming its racial and murderous past. And I don't want to delve or spend much time on these issues, but I think one thing to bear in mind is that this myth still operates today, right? It's a very important myth about Germany. Fast forwarding in time, and I made a really jump in time, and I want to focus a little bit on the post 9/11 context and the ensuing global war on terror. In Germany, as in many other countries, the presence and existence of Muslims started to increasingly being associated with problems. That is to say, Muslims started to be framed as problems to be solved, as problems in relation to potential terrorist violence, to gender inequality, to homophobia, anti-Semitism, and I think scholarship on Islamophobia has shown the similarities between countries along these lines, right? Like how this particular frame of appraising Muslims as problems has taken a strong hold. And I think one of an important consequence of such frame is that it also blocks the possibilities to see, appraise, and discuss all those experiences of hatred, discrimination, and ultimately racism that Muslims face in their everyday lives. Against this background, in 2006, by initiative of the Minister of the Interior, the German Islam Conference, the Deutsche Islam Conference, is founded, and this institution was inaugurated as the institution of the state as the institution of the state to solve all these problems, right? To solve all those problems associated with Islam and Muslims. As many scholars have pointed out, in regard to this institution, it can be seen as the institutionalization of the problematization of Muslims in the country, right? It appears to solve all these issues. At the outset, the Islam Conference was presented as a forum of dialogue between state representatives and representatives of Islamic organizations, as well as Muslim individuals. But again, as scholars like Shirimani Wassami or Werner Schiffauer have pointed out, instead of a dialogue, it has functioned more as a monologue where the state dictates the agenda. And this is clearly the case, as some organizations partaking in the conference early on, already in 2007, pushed for the inclusion of discussing discrimination, hatred, and racism against Muslims, and they were met with reluctance. And when, after some years, the conference finally decided to talk about these issues, the end result was to seeing all forms of discrimination in the labor market, on the streets, on housing, and so on and so forth. And all this is very well documented. Instead of seeing this as a form of racism, they decided instead to frame it as simply a hostility, right? Hostility towards Islam. And the second example from the state pertains to how Islamophobic incidents have been counted or not, right? It was not until 2017, after pressure from international and local groups and organizations, that the government finally decided to measure the extent of these crimes, right? And under the rubric of politically motivated hate crimes. In short, from the state point of view, there has been strong reluctance to acknowledge the existence of Islamophobia as a form of racism. So now I want to talk a little bit about how Islamophobia as a form of racism in fact does exist. And I'll do this by briefly talking about racial conspiracy theories of population replacement. This is something that my colleague Sarah Bracke and I have been working for the last couple of years. In general terms, racial conspiracies on population replacement posit the existence of a plot, sometimes hidden, sometimes in the open. And this plot supposedly is oriented towards replacive native, indigenous, white populations of Europe by Muslims and migrants. And according to this view as well, such replacement is taking place through two interrelated processes. First, migration towards Europe, and second, the strategic use of higher birth rates as a long-term warfare strategy to replace European by Muslims, right? And so far, there have been different versions or names. We also name them signatures of the population replacement conspiracies, being Islamization, Eurabia, the Great Replacement, and Umvolkung, the most prominent ones. And one of the salient features of these conspiracies, as Alexander pointed out, is that they have, well, not only conspiracies, but of these discourses, is that they have become mainstream during the last couple of decades, so to say. Another important point to note about these conspiracies is that although at face value, they seem to only be about stopping or expulsing the Muslim mother, they also have another side. They have another side, which is trying or seeking to gain control upon white women reproductive practices and rights, because in this view, for instance, abortion is an impediment to keep making babies, white babies, right? So it's a complex process. It's a complex discourse that we have been researching lately. And recently, different scholars as well, Matthias Gardel, Reza Zia Ibrahimi, Sindre Bakstam, have pointed out the use of conspiracy theories as a shared characteristic of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. And these scholars argue that conspiracy theories are one of many components in the racial characterization of religious communities, such as Jews and Muslims. And then, I want to talk a little bit about how these conspiracy theories have been mobilized as justification and warrants for political violence. On February 19, 2020, the news of a terrorist attack committed by a lone wolf far-right terrorist in the city of Hanau shocked Germany. The terrorist targeted 2 shisha bars, killing 9 persons. He also killed his mother and finally took his life. The motivation behind his attacks were laid out in a 20-page manifesto, by and large comprising a racial worldview, misogyny, and a particular hatred towards Muslims. Just some months before the Hanau shooting on November 9, 2019, another far-right terrorist attempted to enter and attack the Jewish community center and synagogue in the city of Halle during Yom Kippur. After his failed attempt, the perpetrator shot a passerby and then headed towards a kebab restaurant where he killed another person and injured 2 more. Eventually, he was caught by the police. In his manifesto also, the perpetrator declared considering attack either a mosque or of the headquarters of Antifa. By and large, the perpetrator expressed hatred towards all those who he deemed as non-white Germans. Both the Hanau and Halle shootings were acts of terrorist political violence inspired by racial conspiracy theories and population replacement. The Halle perpetrator confessed believing that a Jewish plot was behind his personal failures. He too subscribed to the conspiracy of population replacement in Europe via migration and birth rates or higher birth rates. But in his case, and in his view, Jews were orchestrating such evil process. The perpetrator of the Hanau shooting also subscribed to the conspiracy of replacement. In particular, he appraised migration as that deleterious process geared towards the extinction of the German white race. In both atrocious instances, conspiracy theories and racism merged into a warrant for political violence, as the perpetrators, similarly as the Utoya massacre, as well as the Christchurch mosque shooting, saw violence as the only way to stop the replacement of white population, as the only way to stop Islamization. The Hanau and Halle perpetrators did not invent these ideologies. Rather, population replacement theories have become established topics in discussion on Muslims and Islam in Germany. The formation, spread, and circulation of population replacement conspiracies and its violent consequences testify to the lasting presence of racism in the country, a reality that instead of being denied, needs to be reckoned with. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this interesting presentation. Okay. Now we are ready to take on more interesting talks. And our third speaker at that is Dr. Alfonso Corral Garcia from the Universidad San Jorge in the passionately sung city of Zaragoza. And he's a former visiting fellow at the Institute for Media Studies. His expertise is, among other things, on communication and Islamophobia, and he will apply it on a Catalonian case where the far right was also using Twitter to communicate things that they would on other channels probably not be able to do as fluently. In this case, it also resulted in a ban, so I'm very interested to hear more about this, Dr. Corral.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to give thanks to Professor Lende Hennen for the invitation to participate in this webinar and in the book that she has edited with Professor Abdel Wahid Mekiberada. Thanks also to Ans, to Alexander, and to Umit for all their hard work in organizing this webinar. And thanks to my colleagues, Désiree, to Luis, and Erkan for their excellent presentations, and to the attendees for their time and interest. Okay, I will try to be brief. To be honest, I would like to not to repeat the same thing that we say in the book's chapter. So please understand this presentation as a sequel to our first work. Basically, I want to share 3 ideas. Firstly, the end of the Spanish exceptionalism towards far-right ideology. Secondly, some data about Islam in Spain. And finally, our case study that links Twitter, Vox, and Islam. As you can see, Vox was born in 2013, seeking to fill the empty space on the right of the Popular Party. He is Santiago Abascal, and he is the leader of Vox since 2014. Here in Spain, nobody doubts that Abascal has lots of personality and magnetism. Yes, he has enormous skills to attract masses. But the first electoral success of Vox came in the regional elections of Andalusia in 2018, when they broke into a regional parliament. Obviously, Vox has risen later than other European countries. However, we should remember that Vox became the third most voted party in Spain on November 2019. Well, apart from that, in Vox nature, we can find many isms. Ideologically speaking, Vox has strong parallelism with other far-right parties in Europe. For example, ethnic nationalism, traditionalism, Catholicism, Euroscepticism, populism, anti-elitism, centralism, or anti-regionalism. Sorry, the list is quite long. Probably the most particular feature of Vox is its opposition to regionalism. Indeed, its 2019 electoral rise came just after the 2017 Catalonia's declaration of independence. An important thing. Okay, Islam in Spain. It's necessary to set some background information on Islam here in Spain. So let's start with the past, with the fact that Spain is the Western country with the longest and deepest tradition of contact with the Arab world. This started before the Crusaders and, of course, colonialism. The presence of Islam here in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, dates back to the 8th century, when they came to Gibraltar. And this presence was constant until the capitulation of Canada. You can see the picture, and the Arab eviction of 1492, approximately 8th century. But nowadays, more than 500 years later, there are around 2 million Muslims living in Spain. In other words, about 4% of the population of Spain is Muslim. 43% of these 2 million are Spaniards, while the rest are foreigners, with a significant presence of Moroccans, as you can see. And this is not a trivial issue because of its story and vicinity. Islamophobia in Spain also involves a certain morophobia. I think it's a new word for you. A word that means hostility and hatred towards the Moors, those human beings who come from North Africa or the Maghreb. Even today, it is common to use the pejorative term Moro, to designate Muslims in general and Moroccans in particular. But these notions includes many other present and past origins, such as Saracens, Berbers, Turks, Ottomans, Persians, Afghans, or even Arabs. So being Muslim in Spain implies being Moorish, and consequently, this Maurophobia is a form of Arabophobia. Interesting. Right. These are the key points of our research methodology that you will check in the book. Now, as we don't have much time, I prefer to set our main objective: to verify the existence of anti-migratory, xenophobic, or Islamophobic discourses in Vox and Abascal tweets. Okay. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, I'm sharing a sequel to the chapter, so I'm going to focus on the hashtag Stop Islamization, the slogan used by Vox during the pre-campaign for the regional parliament of Catalonia. First, it's necessary to present some tweets. Maybe in English is better for you. Some tweets that serve as a prelude to subsequent events. 3 posts that link to 3 news headlines. The first ties jihadism to the arrival of migrants. It was published on January 11. The second one, points out the Islamic State that had ordered an attack here in Spain. And finally, the third one says that the secessionist politicians of Catalonia prefer to teach Islamic religion rather than the Spanish language. Keep the flag in your mind, please. However, it was not until January 27 when we saw the Stop Islamization hashtag for the first time. It was a retweet of Ignacio Garriga's post, the Vox president in Catalonia. I read out the tweet. They preach secularism, but they implement Islam in the classroom. We are taught about pluralism, but freedom is increasingly reduced. They sing the praises of coexistence, but local people have been obliged to join forces to defend themselves. Stop Islamization. We will take back Catalonia. This tweet was accompanied by a propaganda video. Tweet produced by Vox. Apparently, they wanted to demonstrate that Islam and immigrants of Arab Islamic origin are a problem that must be eradicated in Catalonia. And for us, the video is a highly accusatory and anti-Islamic piece made from news headlines and images riddled with Islamic icons and the 2017 attacks in Barcelona. In just 2 days, the hashtag Stop Islamization was repeated 29 times. For this reason, in my opinion, it is extremely interesting to know some of the most repeated words in those tweets. The first block includes terms related to Islam, such as mosques, fundamentalists, religion. The second one related to immigration or collectives. Please keep that menace and accompany migrant minors. Keep this term in your mind, which could be the subject of many doctoral theses here in Spain or even in Europe. And finally, the third block includes terms about immigration in a negative sense, such as mafias, invasion, security, patera, borders, expulsions. Well, if the workload is not quite revealing for you, please check out these screenshots of the Discord video I have just introduced. It starts with this wonderful view of Barcelona. See the Sagrada Familia Cathedral or the coast, the top of the image, and the classic Allahu Akbar. Please read the text. The yellow words at the top correspond to the voiceover, and the ones you will see at the bottom to news headlines. It's another one. Another one. Quran. And news headlines: Mohammed, the most common name for babies in Bex Empordà, region of Catalonia. Bex Empordà. Another one. I promised that at the end of my presentation, I share the YouTube link to the video. And I imagine you are shocked right now. You are not alone, because you should know that Muslim communities established in Catalonia managed to get Vox official Twitter account temporarily blocked. It's normal. Another one. They argued that Vox had spread message installing hatred. Another one. Wow, this is spectacular. This is the mosque of Palafrugell, a small city in Girona. And just in front of the mosque, Vox placed a billboard with the mantra "Separatism takes us to the Islamic Republic of Catalonia." Also, it should be explained that Vox modified the Catalan pro-independence flag, the star one, changing the original for the crescent moon. Awesome. Pues, this is the last frame, which shows its national slogan, Solo queda Vox. Vox. There is only Vox. Okay. Here's the last example, which perfectly sum up the campaign strategy in Catalonia. Okay. We have reached the end of the presentation, and to conclude, I would like to introduce 5 questions to continue this debate. First, have we experienced Islamophobia in this tweet or in the video? 2, what prevails in this conflict? Hate speech or freedom of speech? Is it justified to block a Twitter account because of the content of these messages? What will happen in following national elections in Spain? Will be Vox part of the next Spanish government in coalition with the Popular Party? Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alfonso, for this very interesting presentation and reminding us that what happens in Spain has been interesting for all of us for centuries and also today. If you have questions for Alfonso, please put them in or answers to his questions, please put them in the Q&A. For now, we will move on to our 4th speaker. which is Professor Erkan Tohuslu from KU Leuven University, and before that, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. His expertise, among many things, is on Islam transnationalism, on which I had the pleasure of following a seminar of his some years ago, and I treasure that fondly. And also the nexus of religion and radicalization is among his expertises. Today he will apply it to inquire how far we are in our knowledge, with gathering knowledge on this nexus. Is this nexus a very simple relationship, or is it rather complex? Professor Tohuslu, please enlighten us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this nice presentation. So, and all of the other colleagues. So I will, what I will discuss now, I think it will be on parallel that they already discussed with or present already. So in this presentation, I will look at specifically the exchange that exists between the far-right Islamophobic groups. Specifically, these are the anti-Sharia and anti-Islam groups. So these are the label that they use. Okay, and the Muslim extremist groups. So these are the radical Muslim extremist groups. They are mostly violent or violent-oriented groups. So here the idea is to look at, to identify, assess, and synthesize specifically the existing literature on the link between these two opposite groups, these opposite movements. So here we will look at specifically the term or the concept of the cumulative extremism or radicalization. We'll touch later on. And by answering the question, is it a mere reaction or counter-reaction based upon mutual antagonism between these two movements, or it's a complex web of different styles of the interactions, and how we define these interactions? Is it a community tension, like between Muslims and non-Muslims? So it can be. Or just an ephemeral escalation, just a kind of an event that triggers another one. So, and then later on, we see some increase and decreases between these reactions. And methodologically, I look at some research, and also some of the literature after 2000 and 2001. So specifically looking at the far right Islamophobic movements and also the Islamist extremism. But the main point is to look at whether they cover this exchange, this cumulative extremism in their works. But before going to look at this cumulative extremism, I want to a little bit clarify how I use these concepts. So I use interchangeably these concepts, radicalization and extremism. So in most of the worlds as well, we may have different we may have different usage of these terms and the concepts. But radicalization is a kind of a gradual process. At the end, we expect a fundamental change, whether religious, political, or cultural change. And extremism is something related to the middle or mainstream. So then the question, what is middle and mainstream? So this is another topic, a discussion topic. And radicalization and extremism, they are old phenomenon. It's not new, but mostly it's very related to the Muslim and Islam nowadays, especially in Europe, and it's very related to the terrorism and violence as well. But it exists so far, especially in the social movement theories, and there is no consensus about these terminologies, especially in terms. What I saw in these studies. Several concepts and several terminologies are used to depict and to define these movements. For example, for the right groups, far right groups, radical right, ethnic radical right groups, or white nationalist groups. And for the Muslim extremists like jihadi Salafis or jihadi Salafism, violent radical Muslims or violent extremist Muslims groups. So these are the different type of the terminologies that can be extensively used by different researchers as well. And what is cumulative extremism? That is the main point of this presentation. So it's a concept that already defined and developed by Roger Idval in 2006. Specifically, he looks at the antagonism that exists between Sharia groups and these anti-Sharia groups in London, in UK, and to understand their interaction by saying that an extremist group feed or fuel another's one's strategies, narratives, actions, or recruitments as well. So this is the process of the cumulative extremism. But later on, we add also some other terms like cumulative radicalism or reciprocal radicalization as well. As a kind of background, how we come to these cumulative or extremism or reciprocal radicalization. So first of all, the rising of the online or offline violence, specifically the offline, the physical ones. Maybe some of you already remember, or I don't know. So 9/11, 2001 Twin Towers attacks done by Al Qaeda and in different geographies. So this is the very turning point. And then I specifically focus on Western side, on Europe. And 2005, for example, the killing of the Van Gogh in the Netherlands, or Danish cartoons, 7/7 London bombings, or Madrid bombings as well later on, and then later on the Charlie Hebdo, whatever these attacks in Brussels and in other European countries, and also the Syrian foreign fighters. So this is a kind of a hard background, so very related to the Muslim extremism, especially this radical, or that I call jihadi radicalism. Specifically, I use the jihadi radicalism. So this is the emergence of the Sharia for Europe groups or these Salafi groups. But at the same time, as a reaction of these terrorist attacks, we see also in European scene the Stop Islamization networks, which started after 2003 and 4. Specifically created by a Danish politician in 2005, then other branches in different countries like Norway, Finland, UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, in Russia, as well as in US. So with different names, but the main idea is to create an awareness of Islamic domination, or Muslim threat, a threat to the liberal democracy, a threat to the gender equality. So we will see some of these terms later on, and also by against of these reactions, we saw also the Sharia for Europe groups developed by the Salafi groups started in UK. These are the typical violent groups. These groups are against democracy, against the secularism, and they want to really and say in their statements to an establishment of the Sharia in Europe. And these groups, even they are not very majority within the Muslim community, they remain a very minor group, but they play a crucial role in the Syrian fight, especially by sending and recruiting Muslim young people and sending them to Syria. So they play this crucial role. These Islam for Europe groups, or for example, the Bad Qassam in Islam for Belgium, they sent many via these groups. They radicalize many young people, and they are now in Syria, and some of them they turn back. And what says this cumulative extremism theory? Actually, there are many things, but there are three basic assumptions that I get from these studies. The first one is an extreme narrative escalates the another one's narrative, so it helps or facilitate the narratives of the opposite groups. And the second, the militant activities and actions of one side trigger the activities of the other side, the opposite groups. So it creates a kind of synergy. And thirdly, in terms of the recruitment, so the opposite movements interactions or the activities or the sharings, whether online or offline, facilitate the process of the recruitment, especially the sustaining of the consolidation of the community. For the first narrative, so what we see is there are some common themes like the Muslim other or the West reinforces each other using some of the same elements, motives, some of the figures and symbols in their arguments. What we see, for example, at the below, what we see at the left below, this is the crusader. So Islam is not welcome. So this is the English Defense League, the Stop Islamization in UK, that they use extensively, this crusader image. Why? Because also the Islam for Europe or the Sharia groups see that the West in war with the Islam. So they are the new crusaders. They invade Muslim territories like Iraq, Syria, or in other countries as well. But they also, these extremist groups, the far-right groups, they use by referring the images taken by, or they taken these images used by or referred by these Salafi groups in their in their magazines or on their websites or in sharings. Some of the terms that they use also, like the main one is the gender equality, the female one. So, for example, this is also a picture, but in other pictures as well, in a street demonstration, these are the white angels of the English Defense League, for example, or they put in front of all of the demonstrations the woman image that's saying that, okay, they are not subordinated to the man, but they are beside the man, not behind the man. But here we don't see actually. Here, for example, this is Fuat Belkacem, so and a spokesperson of the Islam for Europe, for example, later on is banned and then forbidden, and he's in jail now because of his efforts of the radicalized young people that they joined in Syria. And for example, these are another term that infidel, that means in Arabic, kafir means infidel. So this is again in a demonstration that of the far right that take it, they use it. We are infidel, as you define us. And most of them are very heterogeneous. Even these Salafi groups, even they are seeming that they want to establish a Sharia, but they are not very well known figures that exist between these people. And also, in the second assumption is the spiral of violence. So once activities normally trigger the others activities. One groups, when they take the streets, and other groups also they want to take streets and that they want to demonstrate. For example, this one is coming from Belgium. These are from the other far right groups in different European cities. And so it's about the escalation of violence. For example, we saw also some clashes between the groups, between far right groups and these Salafi groups as well. These are the physical violences. And the third assumption is about the recruitment. Even these groups are very heterogeneous groups, but these the narratives that they use facilitate the narratives they use against each other facilitate the recruitment mechanism. But there are some questions otherwise. Is it an online recruitment or an offline, or these persons that they join, they already radicalized, or they are already familiar with these ideologies, or just simply as a reaction to the other groups that they are open to these radical groups and they become very vulnerable. So there are some lack of the empirical evidences that what we see most of these studies, specifically the reliable data sets are missing. So this is another aspect of the study that should be deepened. So this should be my final point. So the cumulative extremism nowadays becomes very important, especially after this capital storm or the attack in US. That means that, okay, the threat is not only coming from the radical Islamist groups, but at the same time, the far-right nationalist groups also, they became a danger or threat to the existing liberal democracies. So we have to look at also on and to turn the direction to these groups as well. And also one of the point is the clashes. If the clashes that they already exist, but they remain at the local level. But if it goes to at the transnational level, what will be the result? So I would like to end here. So I think it's the time. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Toguslu, for once again a very thorough look at concepts.